Let's look at the New South Wales election now, because it is pretty fast approaching. Cost of living, the major issue. And this comes after we've seen a lot of COVID support from both federal and state governments in the last couple of years. I want to bring in the director of Redbridge Group, Simon Welsh now. Simon, thanks so much for your time. As you've been doing your research, cost of living is coming up. We fully expect that. But I find it really interesting that you've found that these, cash handouts, the vouchers, they're not really vote winners, are they?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's right. It's a really interesting kind of dynamic around that. So certainly, cost of living is just on fire. Don't need focus groups to tell us that. But people there's sort of this almost like sort of cynicism is probably the wrong word, but kind of a sort of a resistance almost to these cashed handouts. So what people are saying is, yeah, $150, $250, yeah, that's great. That might help me cover one bill, but that very quickly disappears into the pit of all these increased costs that I'm dealing with at the moment. So governments aren't really able to give enough to make people sort of sit up and go, wow, that's fantastic. And the one-off nature of it is just seen as a drop in the ocean, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of thing. So what people are really looking for are sort of deeper, bolder kind of actions from government that will lead to sort of more systemic control of prices and price ranges and those sorts of things, which of course, in the context of a state politics, in the context of a state campaign, is a very difficult thing to find that sort of policy sweet spot that will do that kind of big, bold action that people are looking for.
Yeah, the bold action is one thing as well, because typically voters want governments or future governments to seek a mandate at elections, but also leaders want to be quite cautious. We see that, and we see if you're too bold, you scare the electorate. But if you're not bold enough, it's kind of same. So it's a pretty tough one in New South Wales, isn't it?
It's a line to walk. Yeah, absolutely right. Sometimes you've got to be careful what you promise. But and then in state politics, you've got another dynamic as well, which is we know that folk tend to, unless you've got a particularly unpopular state government, which is not the case in New South Wales, that despite a lot of the issues that are floating around, they're not sort of toxic in the same way. For a moment, if I can talk about, Scott Morrison going into the election last year, that there was a toxicity around his brand for a number of voters. You don't see that same sort of issue around Dominic Perrottet, for example. So you've got this whole other issue of trying to get people to focus on, engage with state politics issues. They don't tend, even in good times, they don't tend to focus on the issues in the same way that they do for a federal election. Federal election is the gold standard. It gets everyone's attention, much bigger media spends, all a whole bunch of things that go into it. State government, you've got to try and keep and hold their attention for long enough to engage with these sorts of things. So again, this is where if you can do stuff that's bold, it does help to capture the opinion. But as you rightly put out, then you've got to live with it and implement it and make sure it happens.
Yes, just quickly, there's a lot of sameness going on in New South Wales. Both leaders, Dominic Perrottet and Chris Minns, seem to be pretty similar. They're both young men. They both have a pretty deep and abiding belief in their faith. And neither of them doing anything crazy. You've also got like this one-upmanship on policy announcements as well. How is that going to go down?
Yeah, it's a really interesting. So what we're picking up is, as I say, there's certainly not this sort of toxicity, but there is this kind of sense of almost, if my measure is, am I better off now than I was at the start of this term of government? Even with COVID and all these other things, the answer there is sort of landing on this kind of no, which is it's sort of translating into this almost this just sort of generic. Well, maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to give the other mob a go. And I think Labor quite cleverly, just keeps talking about the health crisis and the crisis in public services, these sorts of things. And they've got good brand equity in those spaces. So I think, it's sort of landing on this. Yeah, I think maybe they've had their go. There's certainly the loss of Gladys feeds into that as well. I think if
Yeah,
Gladys was
interesting.
still there, we'd be having a very different conversation. But because there was an identification with her, and through COVID, there was an identification with her, they credited her with a lot of the good things that happened in New South Wales compared to the rest of Australia. Dominic Perrottet doesn't carry that equity with him. So that's sort of gone. They've lost that. And so the conversation is more about, well, what's happened since he's come, and, look, things have gotten worse. Not a good position to be in as a government
Okay.
heading into an election.
Simon Welsh, thanks so much.